Good evening. Welcome to the Massachusetts Historical Society. I'm Gavin Cleesby, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for MHS. And I'm happy to welcome everyone who's here in person, as well as all the people who are joining us online. The Massachusetts Historical Society, to anyone visiting us for the first time, is the first historical society in America. We were founded in 1791. And as I like to comment, when we were founded, our founder wrote to Paul Revere, and Paul Revere wrote back. We hold close to 14 million manuscript pages in our collection. This includes the papers of 3 of the first 6 US presidents, including John Adams and John Quincy Adams, which is not particularly surprising since they were from Massachusetts. But we also hold the largest collection of the private papers of Thomas Jefferson. We've been making our collections available to researchers for the past 232 years. And today, anyone who'd like to use our collection is welcome to come. It's open to anyone free of charge. We also host a wide variety of programs. MHS is a membership-supported organization. So if you enjoy our programs, we hope you'll come back to future programs. And we hope you'll also consider becoming a member or making a donation to support our work. This evening, we're happy to welcome Dr. Patricia Strach and Dr. Kathleen Sullivan, who will be discussing their new book, The Politics of Trash. Dr. Strach is a professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration and Policy and a Howard J. Samuels State and City Policy Center Fellow at SUNY Albany. Her current research examines the opioid epidemic in local communities. Dr. Sullivan is an associate professor of political science and graduate program director of the Masters in Law, Justice, and Culture at Ohio University. Her research interests include public law and American political development. This evening, they'll be discussing their new book, The Politics of Trash, which explains how municipal trash collection solved odorous urban problems using non-governmental and often unseemly means. So please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming out tonight to hear a talk about garbage. We understand that this is not so out of the ordinary because there is a rat problem in Boston, and we are very sorry to hear about that. And as awful as that is, and as helpful as we'd like to be, we don't have any solutions to the rat problem. But we do have some helpful suggestions about where to look when there is a rat problem. So when we see a rat problem, we don't see rats as the problem. People are, and more likely public officials are, because a rat problem is actually a public problem, and it requires public officials to come up with solutions. It is a political problem and a governmental issue. So in short, when you see a rat problem, look around to see whose behavior officials are trying to shape, who is receiving the blame, and who is deflecting blame. Sorry. Get to the next one. So the rat problem you are facing is not all that different from the late 19th century garbage problem that we write about in our book, The Politics of Trash. And what we find is that mounting piles of trash were a problem for 19th century cities, and it was not clear at the time, just like the rat problem now, what to do or how to do it. And our book compares how cities created and carried out municipal garbage collection programs. Starting in the 1890s, there was a wave of these garbage collection programs that kind of went across the country. And we found that garbage collection at this time was intensely political. And that sounds really interesting because you don't necessarily think about garbage as political because it seems so mundane today. You take your bin to the curb once a week, a truck comes by, collectors put it in the truck, and it whisks it away. And the fact that we don't think about garbage collection as political, we argue in our book, is an amazing feat of governance. And we're going to tell you about why that is the case. There's a wave of garbage ordinances that were passed during a time when cities were run by political machines. It was dirty in the streets and it was dirty in politics. And it wasn't just that there was these machine politics that makes garbage collection so political. Garbage collection is political because it uses government authority and power. Right? So municipal garbage collection programs were new public programs, and it required local governments to take on new tasks and to develop new capacities. It required governments to use technology and from engineers and sanitarians, and residents had to do things with their garbage in new ways. It required governing, and where there is governing, there is always politics. So when we encounter current events like your rat problem, we see glimpses of just how political garbage collection is and how important it is for the public good. So we'd like to review some history of garbage collection to suggest that it isn't just history, but it is politics. So before we get into our garbage politics, we'd like to pause to acknowledge what a problem garbage collection was. So at the time, and still today, households produce waste. And this could be food waste, this could be packaging, old clothing, ashes, and peepers. And people were accustomed to doing things with their waste the way they had always done it, right? So they might bury it in a privy, that's an outhouse in the backyard. They might dump it in an empty lot. They might hire a scavenger to collect it, and that scavenger might just dump it in an empty lot or in a river. They might sell their food waste to a farmer who would feed it to his hogs. And these methods were actually good enough for a long time until cities grew. And as more and more people moved to cities, they became more concentrated, right? And if people are burying their waste into a backyard privy, a hard rain is just going to wash that waste down the hill and into the water supply, and it becomes a public health hazard. So by the late 19th century, garbage is no longer an individual issue. It is a public problem, and it requires a public solution. So we look at garbage collection programs in medium-sized cities. These aren't the usual cities. This is not the Boston, the New Yorks, and the Chicagos of the time. These are kind of the secondary cities in the states where they're located. They're of similar size, so we can compare them one to another. And you can see on this slide of some photos from those cities. They were Pittsburgh, St. Louis, New Orleans, Charleston, and San Francisco.
So as this garbage problem was mounting, what we find is that there were people who knew what to do. There were experts who were available. And in this time period, you had sanitarians who had been tracking the health risks from garbage for decades. And they've been trying to institute municipal garbage collection in local boards of health. We also had engineers, and they were ready to build devices and disposal plants. They were ready to make contracts with cities. So there was a lot of knowledge and people willing to do things at this time. So what we have here is a picture of the digesters in a reduction plant. So reduction was this innovative process of garbage disposal that was actually favored by sanitarians. Here's a kind of schematic of what a reduction plant looked like. So at a reduction plant, you'd sort garbage, you'd put it into these digesters, steam would cook the garbage, and then the steam would escape, and then you send the remaining garbage through the hopper to presses, and the idea is to press out water and grease, and then the grease could be captured and sold for profit. Done correctly, sanitarians considered this to be a sanitary process. They preferred it to something like incinerators or landfills. And it was appealing to contractors in cities because it was an innovative way to use waste to make a profit. And there were other experts around at this time too. So there were also municipal reformers, right? If we think about like this period of the 1890s, municipal reformers were getting together. They wanted to design city government to reduce corruption and to be able to carry out public works like garbage collection, but also other things, right? Water provision, public parks, all those sorts of projects that were going on in this time period. And then there were civic organizations where a lot of women got involved. That was their kind of way of getting involved in politics. And they, among their projects was cleaning cities. So what we found is that there were so many experts and reformers and people who wanted to do things at this time, and they urged cities to do something about it. But we found that just because there's a problem and just because there's experts available to know how to solve it didn't mean that officials would create garbage collection programs. Garbage was a problem for years until cities decided to do something about it. So we found a few key features that are necessary to go from knowing there's a problem and knowing how to solve it to actually doing something about it. So what we find is that even when there's expertise and technology and experts are in hand, that's not enough until it's not enough to solve a problem until a city decides to take it up. So what we found was really important to shift from knowing there was a problem to actually initiating municipal garbage collection programs was that cities needed the political will to launch municipal garbage collection programs. And so city governments really didn't take up their own municipal garbage programs until they realized that they could benefit from them. So this is a picture of a page of the Pittsburgh annual reports. It shows a page of street paving contracts. And so if you look on the right, you can see the name Booth and Flynn shows up a lot. So William Flynn was a partner in this street paving company, and he won a lot of contracts in Pittsburgh. He was also a boss of the political machine in Pittsburgh. So when it was time to have a garbage collection program in Pittsburgh, they decided to contract it out, and they contracted out to William Flynn's brother. And so that was clearly corruption, right? So what we find is that there's actually something going on here. We know that William Flynn being in charge had the political will to make this happen, but corruption didn't mean that he kind of botched Pittsburgh's garbage collection program. Actually, his street paving company would have had horses, carts, drivers, facilities to know how to operate these things. And those kind of resources could be lent to the garbage collection program. So corruption, we found, could bolster a city's ability to provide services. So Pittsburgh's garbage collection actually in our book ends up being a pretty good garbage collection program. It was corrupt and they got the garbage picked up. So that's what we found with Pittsburgh. So in some cases, corruption could actually provide political will and could also provide the capacity to actually get garbage picked up. But then we found that you could set up all these garbage collection programs and have the horses and have the carts and have it all up and running. And then if people did not put their garbage in their garbage cans and put them out in the proper place on the proper day at the proper time, none of this was going to work. So all of these garbage collection programs required compliance of residents. And again, as Patty had mentioned, people were used to just, dumping these things in their backyard or in the river. People weren't really ready to comply with garbage collection programs. So we realized that a lack of compliance could actually bring a whole garbage collection system down in the 1890s and early 20th century. And related to that is when things went wrong with garbage collection programs, cities were quick to blame others for their own shortcomings. So when programs didn't work, we find that public officials would deflect criticism. They might blame residents for not doing their job. They might blame trash collectors. They might blame poor neighborhoods. So there's a lot of blame going on at this time. But what we find is often deflection for kind of improperly administered city services. So blame comes up when things are going wrong for governments, basically.
When we can illustrate just how difficult this problem is by looking at the garbage can problem, right? And we can take for granted today that we all put out the right can at the right place at the right time, but this was really difficult in the 19th century, as Kathleen said, how to get people to comply. So, the cities could create garbage collection programs, they could pass the ordinances, they could buy the wagons, they could buy the carts, or they could contract out to somebody, they could get everything in place, and they could pretty effectively collect trash from businesses in the city center. But the program would still fail if residents didn't do their part. And that's exactly what happened with the garbage can problem. They ran into the problem of residents not doing what they were supposed to do. So we had mentioned earlier that when cities created new trash collection programs, people were resistant. They were used to doing things a certain way. They were used to putting it in the privy. They were used to selling it to a farmer. They were used to just tossing it into the streets. So residents didn't naturally wanted to comply, and they often wanted to do things the way they had always done it. So the city might say, and for trash collection, this is one of the difficult things. For trash collection program to work, everybody has to do exactly what they're supposed to do in the way they're supposed to do it. So just like today, if you put your trash out on a Wednesday and not on a Tuesday when it's going to be collected, that doesn't work. If you put it in the wrong bin, I don't know how many of you have those little arms, like the trash comes out in the arm, dumps it into the can. If you put it out in the wrong bin, the arm can't grab it. Right. So it's exactly the same thing in the 19th century. Residents, so the city would lay out exactly what residents were supposed to do, and residents would just ignore it. They might use any wooden box or barrel they had lying around. They didn't want to rush out and buy something. And they might, leave it out uncovered, and that would create new problems. A dog could tip it over. Its contents could spill, rats would come and eat the trash and spread it throughout the city. And so Charles Chapin called this problem the garbage can problem, one of the most commonest nuisances to be found. Right. So this was a huge problem, because if you can't get residents to change their behavior, if you can't get them to do what they're supposed to do, then it doesn't matter how many programs you have and how many collectors you hire, the program still will be a failure. And it was a problem with a solution that cities didn't necessarily have access to. So cities could hire engineers, and engineers could design the reduction plant that Kathleen talked about with the fancy, hoppers and et cetera. And a sanitarian could then take these engineering designs and then talk about what's the best way to use them. So for example, garbage carts would run through the city and trash would fall out the top of the carts and spill to the city. And so a sanitarian might say, look, we need to cover those garbage carts so we don't have trash falling all over the place. But if residents didn't put their cans out properly, it doesn't matter how many experts you have and how many innovations they can come up with. And so this kind of laggard compliance was a public problem that could only be solved by people changing their private behavior. And if you think to your own trash collection practices, you'll realize how much of what the city, what government wants you to do comes back in and takes place within your own home. Right. So for those of you that are recycling or composting, you have your bin of trash, but you also have your bin of recyclables and your bin of compost, right? That gets placed where it's supposed to get placed. So you have to sort your trash now, just like you did then, so that the facility, right, the reduction process sells that grease. So it only is taking grease producing items, and other things like old shoes have to be disposed of in a different way. So people had to sort their trash in their homes, and then right outside the homes, they had to store their trash and have it ready for garbage day. And so how do you get people to do what they don't want to do? That is the problem of governance. It's the problem of governance today, and it was the problem of governance at the time. And that's where women's civic organizations came in. So middle-class women were heavily involved in civic organizations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And they were interested in cities being clean, and they were eager to get involved. And so when cities were dirty, these women were very invested in helping write and pass the ordinances to create these collection programs. But the trouble was that these corrupt political officials did not want these do-gooder civic organizations anywhere near them. So they kind of kept these women at arm's length. And in the cities we studied, you could see the civic organizations, they continue to work on city sanitation, but it's kind of outside the formal realm of politics, formal government programs. So they might have a cleanup day, and they might have a fly campaign where, children are encouraged to kill flies. They might, for real, they might raise money to put public trash cans on streets. But they were largely kind of marginalized. Government didn't want them, involved, and they kind of did this on the side. Until cities had this garbage can problem. And when they couldn't solve the garbage can problem, right, when they tried to use force and that failed, They turned to women's civic organizations to serve as the mediator between what the city wants and what people are doing in their homes. So here's a photo of St. Louis Civic Organization women at an outing to the dump, and they are being invited to inspect city garbage conditions. Here's another clipping. This is from Louisville, showing women actually arrive and they gain seats in city government. So now they're being invited in when this problem isn't being solved. And they're acting as officials, and they're acting to teach people how to comply with garbage ordinances. But even when they weren't invited into cities, even when they weren't, serving, working with public officials, being hired by cities officially, women's civic organization could still instruct and persuade people in the social sphere. So one thing that these women's civic organizations did is they worked to educate and encourage householders to act in ways that the city wanted them to act. So here's Louisville, and here is a women's civic organization made up these flyers that you see with the list of things to do and a list of things not to do. Do drain your garbage, because wet dripping garbage is disgusting. Imagine what that smells like. So there are steps that people can take in their homes to facilitate the collection of garbage and its disposal. And to really comply meant that people had to change their habits in their homes. And some people were very eager to do just that. So here, this is some, you can see some illustrations from the 1910s. These are ads in Good Housekeeping targeted towards women. Maybe because who can keep their kitchens clean? Who can master the fine art of garbage management with the latest contraptions? It is just about as ingenious as the large-scale public works projects that the engineers had. So you had these engineers designing these wonderful devices, and then you have the Amico refuse can in your home kitchen. So in this household scale, people could modernize, they could keep up with the times, and they could take pride in the homes and the things that they purchased to do it. We see a few things going on in these ads. These are things that are available to a middle-class person. This is not something that's in everybody's reach. And not everyone also has the time to manage their garbage in this way. And not everyone has the public services to keep their home so tidy. So if you are in an underserved neighborhood where the trash doesn't get picked up, it doesn't matter how many of these devices you might purchase. So here's some photo from the Kingsley collection at the University of Pittsburgh archives. And so this kind of shows you the opposite side. Reformers were documenting the living conditions of residents who live in poor neighborhoods. And these photos suggest the lack of running water, the use of outhouses, unpaved streets. And they show you also that, a lot of families lack the public services that kept homes and environments sanitary. So these neighborhoods, they're never going to be buying the kinds of Good Housekeeping ads that we just saw. They're not going to be using those devices. They just don't have the resources to do it. So because compliance rested on people changing the habits in their homes, and women's civic organizations were running around publicizing that and educating people on what they ought to do, tidy garbage management practices in the home came to be seen as something personal. This isn't the government that's making me do what I'm supposed to do. This is me being a good person. This is me being a good citizen. So on the one hand, you got to take pride in what a good person you were in helping in these civic endeavors. And on the other hand, people who lack this tidiness came to be seen as incidents of personal failure. So instead of everybody creating, a mess, we have kind of this two different sides of the same coin. And now middle-class women didn't just take pride in the home, they could pronounce that they were doing it the right way. And at the same time, if they're modeling the right way to do things, there is also a wrong way to do things. And they could point that out, and they could point out the people who were doing it wrong. And this gets to one of the features we found in municipal garbage collection programs, that when city governments failed to get garbage collection programs going, they cast about for someone to blame. They're never going to say, this is my fault, I didn't do a very good job. And they really kind of pointed to three different groups of people. The prior political regime, right? So the reason that streets are a mess is that the previous administration did a really terrible job. But if they had been in power for a while, that wasn't so easy to do. So then they moved on to two other categories of people. They would say, look at these poor neighborhoods. They are to blame. They can't keep themselves clean. And if that didn't work, or in addition to that, they would say these garbage collectors are doing a very poor job and they're creating the messes that we see.
So yes, we think garbage is political. It was a political decision to initiate garbage collection in the 1890s. And then it was political in that governments needed to use their power to shape people's behavior and then sort of hide that. It's a hidden form of power, but it's there. The fact that we just roll our cans out to the street these days on the right day in the right container is a feat of governance. Like this picture that is up, well, that was up there, is a feat of governance. Local governments now have the capacity to carry out garbage collection, so we don't really think of them exercising politics anymore. But we engage in it by complying without even thinking that we're dealing with government or politics or compliance or power, but it's all there. And sometimes it still peaks out. So garbage collection remains local. I mean, that's a pretty interesting thing about what we studied. You know, we found all these newfangled contraptions back in the 1890s, and then we found that it still today kind of sort of looks like it did back then in many ways. But still, it's different, right? Because different towns all have different ways of collecting garbage. And you probably know that if you've ever moved, and then you have to find out, what kind of garbage can do I use? What kind of recycling bins do you use here, right? Like, and so there continues to be these moments where you need to learn what the rules are in your town. And, you know, the city may have different facilities, right? They may have the arm that from the truck that lifts the can, and that's going to require you to use a certain kind of can. And it's easier for the city to facilitate that collection method if they just provide the cans, right? That's a trend now, so that if everyone went out and bought their own can, they might like mess up and not get the can they're supposed to. So governments continue to kind of smooth this process and not make us think about making choices or resisting the method of garbage collection. But people need to be educated, continually educated. So you need to be educated when you move to a new town, but also like maybe your recycling methods change. And so now you're not sure, are we sorting our recycling? Are we all putting it in one bin? Do we have to wash it out, right? Like, so those things continue to there continues to be a need for information for residents, and it's often ongoing, that you need to keep up with the technology that's changing in the facilities in your town. We also find that, you know, you need to know what these rules are, and you can now get fined for non-compliance. Like this one looks kind of harsh about where, I mean, that's okay, but some people choose to do that in their towns. But, you know, you don't really see people getting really furious when that happens, right? I think now it's like fine for a town to fine you if you've broken the municipal rules, because it's like, oh, that's my fault, I didn't follow the rules. Instead of resisting government and thinking that, you know, they're not supposed to be doing this. This is invading my privacy. Really, people just figure this is normal now. And so that is what we see as a feat of governing, all the ways in which this has been normalized, hidden, and we don't really think it's tyrannical for governments to require that we engage in this practice with them. So there's all sorts of ways that we see garbage as being political, that governments use their authority, they use power to shape people's behavior, it becomes a normal, mundane part of people's lives, and it betters the lives of everyone, right? Garbage collection is good for everyone. It is a public good, it's a public health measure, and it serves the common good. So government's using its power is not always a bad thing, right? It needs to use its power to be able to make sure these programs happen. So even though we've studied garbage collection history, we still think a lot about garbage politics today. And we do see this politics pop up once in a while. So, all the sorts of stuff going on with the rats is something that we don't, neither of us live in New York City or Boston or other places where this is a problem, but we see a lot of familiar refrains when we look at cities discussing rat problems. So this is a little slide from a recent article from Slate magazine. And when you see this article talk about the rat problem, what they do is they look around and they see who's doing the blaming. So this article says that rats are a community problem and one that requires a community solution. And yes, that is what we found with the garbage problem in the 1890s. Now, this article runs through like what kind of solutions a city can have to the rat problem. And it says the biggest change needs to be in the garbage. So they suggest that residents use hard-sided trash cans, or better yet, the city could use containerization, these large metal containers that take up a parking space on the street, and people could just store their trash in those containers until it gets picked up. And they said they actually tried a pilot program of this in Hell's Kitchen. And they said when they were running this program, they took pictures and the sidewalk was blissfully clear of trash. And residents said the rats disappeared. So there you have solutions, expert knowledge, right? There are solutions available. So then you might ask, why isn't the city using this? Well, the article says, the city declared it a failure. Some bins can be emptied by automatic arms on garbage trucks, but these had to be emptied by hand. Bags ended up outside the bins, so non-compliance. That could be because residents didn't use them properly. It could be because they weren't emptied enough. It's a problem that's solvable with more labor and education. So as we face these ongoing rat problems in our cities, we can acknowledge that cities need to try new things. So they do need expertise and technology to come up with solutions that can work to solve the problem, but that's not going to be enough, right? They're going to need political will to take the next step and to be sure that the local governments follow up with this and institute these and follow through with it. Cities are going to need capacity. So if you're going to set up a containerization program that is on city streets, well, maybe you need to work with your streets department and parking, right? To be sure that streets are cleared. So it's going to take coordinated efforts of city agencies. Garbage is never just about garbage. And you could see it in this case. And obviously they're going to need compliance, right? They're going to need people to use these containers and use them properly. And even if they're not used to using them, people need to develop new habits to go along with these new programs. And then what you're probably going to find is that when these programs don't work, somebody's going to get blamed. It's going to be the residents. It's going to be the other political party. It's going to be the rats, instead of thinking that it is a public problem that public officials need to respond to. So when we see a rat problem, we look around to see who's getting blamed. And then we turn around and see who's doing the blaming, because that's really telling us who's deflecting. And rats are a problem, and it has to do with garbage. And garbage is a political problem that requires a political solution, and it requires governing. So the history of garbage collection is political, and every once in a while, we're reminded it still is. So thank you.
I'm sure our speakers would be happy to answer questions if we have any questions from the audience.
That was great. I like to give people credit and say people want to do the right thing. Yeah. And you look around in parks and there's a trash can that's just overflowing. People have walked over to try to use that trash can and they found it full. So here in Boston, we do a little bit of education about how to recycle, particularly recycling. And it becomes really onerous to find out, oh, is that milk carton? Can I do that or not? And people will go a little ways to try to find out, can I recycle this? And then if it becomes, there's some tipping point where they just stop. They say, oh, I can't find out, I'll just throw it away. So to me, education and constant repeated education is the key here. And can you talk a little bit about what some of the cities that you've studied, how they used education back in the 1890s, and what kind of education besides the women's groups
Yes.
to help educate people?
So let me think besides women's groups. I mean, I do think that cities did try to get the word out. What we found was that one of the problems with cities was using a kind of soft power when they were doing that. I mean, cities could fine people. That was a little bit of a problem the cities had, because they might say, oh, people aren't doing it right, so we'll issue a fine. But people were already resistant to it anyway. They already felt like it was inappropriate. So if cities fined and used hard power against residents, they were just actually making them react. I mean, in New Orleans, the people were so resistant to having to sort their garbage. Patty mentioned shoes, and I kind of laughed because they were so mad they couldn't put shoes in the garbage to send to the reduction plant that they resisted. It actually brought down the mayoral regime. So cities were not, there was a lot of corruption. It wasn't just the garbage, but it was part of it. So I think cities found that if they tried to push the rules, it was and it was coming from the city, it was too much. So that's where we saw this deflection. We do have a recent example that we've encountered, which is in Columbus, Ohio. They are starting a curbside composting program. And, that is a hard thing to get people to, like understand all the rules and know what to keep up with. And it's hard to communicate. So they actually started with children. They taught it in the schools, and the kids brought it home and they taught. So that's another resource that we have, right? And kids want to do it, right? And then it's easy. So that's another resource. But we would see the children there as a resource of government, right? Not just as a civic thing, but that it's actually, follows that chain. And that's, we tie it back to government.
So cities did have education campaigns, and they did have, like in some of the newspapers, there's a big, spread on what people are supposed to do and to not do. And also in those newspaper clippings, they're saying it's not really effective until someone comes to your house, until that person coming to your house is speaking to you as someone who's in a similar situation. So it was like a city official saying, we can have education campaigns, we can talk to people all we want, but they're not listening to us. They're listening. And that's one of the reasons they hired these women, right? Because these women are going and talking to other women, because women were kind of in charge of the house and the household and the kitchen refuse. And so until they did that, it was kind of falling on deaf ears. But when someone came to them, and that's one of the things about the clipping, they had one like, that these women from the city were talking to women householders, and they were saying at the time, yes, we'll do exactly what you want us to do. And then it was in those ways that we got people to change their behavior. And also, to bring a contemporary example, when we saw the COVID restrictions and vaccinations, and everyone's like, no, I'm not doing that. And then you said government do exactly the kinds of things that we were talking about, going and talking to church leaders and going and talking to trusted people in communities, because they know that if the government just comes out and tells you to do something, that's not very effective for most people. It's much more effective to kind of come in through the communities of people that they trust.
I thought of another one while you were talking. I think St. Louis, had a like a new garbage can contest, like design a new garbage can, and that got people really invested.
I'm just curious to hear if you thought about alternatives where maybe they took a road in their effort to just get a system in place, where maybe they missed something or they lost something. There was a recycling way already, or anything like that.
Boy, there such great questions and so much to talk about. So I think maybe I'll start from sort of the back, which is the idea of the cities continuing to use technology, and you're wondering, do we need that? I think that's a nice moment to think again that this is political, and we're so used to just cities are doing this, but there may be a kickback to somebody, or who knows why they're investing in this new technology. In Athens, we had these public garbage cans that like use solar power to turn on and squish the garbage down, and then a truck would come by, and they were like $250,000 or something, and we live in a really poor town, and I don't understand who benefited from that, right? And so I think when we have moments like that, we can remember this is political. Why are you doing this? We don't have to be doing it this way. And so sometimes I think garbage collection has been so normalized, and we just expect it to be keeping up with technology that we forget about these contracts and deals that are being made. So it is a good time to question our city governments when they're doing this newfangled technology. That's maybe not necessary.
I was gonna say, one of the most striking things in writing this book is how little has changed. Like, we're reading, I mean, we're essentially doing the same thing that they did, 150 years ago, right? So you put your trash out and some cart comes along and collects it and it gets dumped somewhere or gets burned. It is the same method. I mean, now we have a truck instead of a horse and cart, and now we send it to a dump that we don't think about instead of one that was like in a city center. But it's the same technology. And in San Francisco, which is one of the studies we looked at, it's the same company that's collecting trash and has been through multiple kind of corruption scandals. And people are like, nope, we still like these guys. So what is so striking to us is that, the label on the truck changes, but the technology, the actual kinds of things that we're doing hasn't. And that's a good question. So why are we still doing it this way? And the other thing you had mentioned was the progressive movements and hogs, when I'm going to bring that book together, is that, when the progressives came in, so a lot of these trash collection programs were set up by very corrupt governments. And there's a lot of bad things that were happening at the time. And then the progressives came in and they cleaned up government and they just swept along the trash collection programs. They didn't redo them. They didn't create new technologies. They didn't rethink these programs. They didn't have the capacity. We talked about William Flynn. They didn't have the capacity to create something new. So they just packaged it. They just called it this progressive trash collection, but it's the exact same thing. So a lot of the kinds of bad things that we saw in the 19th century just get baked into the programs that we still have to this day. So if you want to unpack why we're doing things, there's a lot of weird things that we're doing that don't necessarily make any sense. And then one of the things that happened with the reformers coming in is that they tried to get rid of corruption, but often corruption and capacity went hand in hand. So in St. Louis, this was a great story about this very corrupt guy named Ed Butler, and he was collecting trash, and the reform mayor comes in and he wants to get rid of Ed Butler, and he's got a plan. He buys an island in the middle of the Mississippi River, and they're going to dump garbage on this island. And this is going to be the solution. This is going to be how they get rid of Ed Butler. And so they do this. Butler had this very kind of advanced, Kathleen was talking about this reduction facility, has a very advanced facility, and they lose all of that capacity. And they're dumping on an island in the middle of the Mississippi River. And then there's too much garbage on the island. So then they bring in hogs to eat all of this trash. This is the 4th largest city in the country at this time. And this is how they're doing. And then there's too much garbage for the hogs to handle. So then they go back to dumping in the Mississippi River. So yes, they got rid of this corrupt guy, but they also got rid of any ability they had to dispose of trash in a sanitary fashion. So there's we're doing things in a way that we've always done things. That's one story. Reformers come in and they put things in place, but they don't actually always make things better.
Yeah, and the other thing that hasn't changed is we still refer to these as departments of sanitation, right? Because these were public health hazards in the 1890s, but where's the sanitation happening? It's getting the garbage out of the concentrated cities, but you're just taking that garbage and moving it somewhere else.
Yes.
In fact, many times it's being sent to rural areas who are buying the garbage, right? Because they're poor and they're buying garbage to have landfills in their areas. So, it's cleaning up the concentrated cities, but it's really not a solution. And so the fact that we are still using the sanitation logic now, very few cities have shifted to thinking of zero waste or some other thing that would keep up with the values that we have today. So, yeah, there's a lot to think about and undo and think about how it's political.
Of pigs for you, Alex.
Building on what you were just saying, we have a question online that was asking about how health concerns and, the meaning of what was sanitary and concerns about the environment over time have changed and affected this.
I think, the story that this comes out of, and one of the things that Kathleen and I, first time we went to the archives, we go to look at the Department of Public Works and there's nothing on garbage. And we're like, we came all the way to Pittsburgh and we can't find anything. And then we found it and it was in Department of Health, Public Health, right? So this whole movement, these sanitarians, these are all health officials who are like, look, people are dying, and people who lived in urban places died at much higher rates than people who lived in rural places. So the reason that we can live in a city like Boston, the whole reason that's an enjoyable place today is in part due to these sanitary measures of clean water and picking up trash. Otherwise, these were not very nice places to be at all. So it comes out of the public health movement. And then I think in the more contemporary times, it has come into this environmental movement and the really, the push for recycling, the push for, trash separation and getting rid of things kind of takes us full circle to where we started before there was public trash collection program. There were these scavengers who would walk around and they would try to take your old cloth and your old paper, and then they would take it to the, factories, and then they would get money for it. And so we've moved into the thing for very different reasons, right? For environmental concerns versus, this is a mode of making a living for people. We've moved into the kind of the same space.
Yeah, I guess it's just there is a current book out by Lily Baum-Collins who actually addresses the question that was being asked, and she looks at which cities have shifted to a more environmental logic, but how many cities haven't. And so that's a nice one to I think it's called Resisting Garbage or something, but that's a good one to think about, to be, once you're really aware of these things, to think about why it's so hard. I mean, back to your question about people want to do the right thing. Like, why is this so hard? I think a book like that can really help us to see how layered it is to shift from sanitation to environmental.
I had a thought. I just spent quite a bit of time in Maine at a place where I wasn't normally living. And so I noticed my garbage was very different than it is normally at home. And I found that 90% of my garbage was packaging. And at the turn of the century, they didn't have any packaging. So this is kind of a new problem we have. And it seems like the composting is going to take care of all the filth. If we can get everybody into composting, then that problem would be solved. All the juicy stuff will go back into soil. But the packaging seems to me the real problem now that we haven't really addressed. That, the Pacific is full of our plastic and China won't take our plastic and everything's plastic. And our town tried to stop the use of cellophane in packaging and they couldn't stop it. They said you can't have plastic bags, and it lasted for about 2 months. The political will wasn't there to deal with the packaging problem, which to me seems to be paramount. Anyway, it's not really a question, is it? Sorry, I just wanted to preach a little bit.
Actually, I have some thoughts on that. And one thing that happens is that like tin cans are an issue in cities at this time. So they do have some packaging. And one of the things that happens is that one of the reasons that cities have so much trash is that they are disposing of things like tin cans. And in rural areas, they're growing their own food and then they're burying it in the backyard or they're burning it, right? So there isn't a trash problem, in part for the exact reason that you're talking about, because there isn't the packaging. They're consuming food that they have, grown or their neighbors have grown, and not this, they've bought a tin can of soup.
Yeah, and people who are studying this today are recognizing that. And so what they're saying is, when we think about garbage, it shouldn't just be like us sitting in our kitchen looking at a waste bin of, cardboard boxes and plastic, and not even where we shop, deciding what to do when we shop, but saying it's not about our personal choice, it's bigger. And if we want to solve this problem, we need to move up and now think about garbage really a lot more broadly with the producers and what they're giving us, and make that part of our concept of the garbage problem.
So that is a great segue into my question, because I was wondering in your research, if back in the day, anyone was thinking about, well, households are supposed to do the right thing, but they also have no control really over what they end up with, right? Because
Yeah.
they don't have control over what's available on the market. And to your point with packaging, they don't have control over how their packages are or how their products are packaged. And so, like, was there any thinking around this, especially around this idea of influencing people to do the right thing, or influencing like further upstream what was coming into the home to begin with back then, that maybe we missed, that we shouldn't have?
I don't know that we ever saw that.
We never saw it. It was always a resident problem. You aren't doing what you're supposed to do. You're not separating your shoes. And the residents were like, what? I can't throw my shoes away. Like, you hired this corrupt guy and you gave him this contract and you paid him tons of money he shouldn't have. So the residents were pushing back, and they had ode to garbage box. They were very upset about that. And they would drape their garbage cans in this black crepe and say like, oh, where's the collector? We haven't seen him. Like, he must be dead or something. So they were always pushing back, but the government officials weren't going to take that on, and they weren't going to take care of kind of the broader problem. They were always just going to say, this is you need to be educated. You need to fix what you do. You need to behave in ways that we want you to. So you can see it in the residents. They're like, not so fast, friend, but the political officials really weren't buying into that.
I mean, this is a time, like, we study Pittsburgh, and this is when Pittsburgh is taking pride in being a smoky city, right? Because that means it's industrious. So I guess that's why we're not seeing, these critical questions about production.
And I have a running argument with a friend about, she's like, yeah, recycling makes a big difference. Yeah. And I was like, no, not really. And how much is the individual perception? Oh, I recycle, I compost, I, give gifts that are wrapped in silk or something like that.
Yes.
How much are the people who are making the larger decisions that affect more of us able to point to those folks and say, well, this is the example, and then just not continue to do anything on a larger scale, which is what we need.
Right.
And why we don't have a Green New Deal, going on now.
Yeah.
I think of your question, I think of that slide, there's a right way to do a thing, right? It's much easier to point to that person and being like, you want people to compost and to recycle, and they're doing things that don't disrupt whatever that larger system is, right? Which sells a lot of things that people don't actually need, right? So the number one way to reduce waste is not to bring a bunch of stuff into your home and not to buy a bunch of stuff. But that's like a much bigger issue than saying there's a right way to do a thing and you're doing it the right way. So I think a lot of officials at the time, probably a lot of officials now would be like, nope, that's great. You're recycling, you're doing your part. What's not, one of the things that's really interesting is that we don't think about what happens after we throw something away, right? Like the garbage barge that's floating around and trying to find a place to dump. And really, that's a story that nobody wants to hear, because then we have to think about, we're selling our garbage to these other countries who are much poorer than we are. We're selling our garbage to these rural areas who are much poorer than we are. And that's a much more difficult conversation, I think, than most political officials, I would say, are willing to have.
When I think about your question, I think about resistance and how resistance is the space for government authority to fail, right? Power dynamics are about one person issuing power and the other person receiving it. And if the recipient doesn't receive it, then it dispels. And, obviously we've all lived through COVID, and we've all seen people resistant to vaccine mandates and things. And we've seen how that can just blow a government program. And so we were really aware of that because we were finishing this book in the early days of COVID. So watching resistance was really familiar to us. And so I think this issue of recycling, we're like, oh, is it really doing anything, or should we do it anyway? Because maybe it will work. Again, that's an issue for governments to take responsibility for that, and to, use the resources they have to make sure that the recyclables have a market to go to, and, make sure that chain gets continued in whatever way it does. And so I do think, like, having arguments with our friends about whether it's useless or not, it's a nice chance to, like, turn and say, wait, who are we blaming here? And let's turn and think about, in this case, like make sure that your local government is doing its job to follow through, just to throw it out there that these power dynamics can work in lots of different directions.
Thanks for the discussion. I was wondering, to the degree that your research uncovered different ways that trash has been collected, and you touched upon some technologies that might not carry a great utility. I was wondering if you ever looked at like pneumatic systems of trash collection, and whether you found that to have any rates of success. I don't know if it's purely modern day or if there were any precursors to it, but I'd be
Modern pneumatic use, where's that being done?
City.
Is it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, we didn't encounter this in our research, but in talking about garbage, it's fascinating how many people like will have their own garbage stories. And so a friend of ours was saying, well, like she lives on Roosevelt Island in New York City, and they have pneumatic tubes. And so then we started looking into these pneumatic, trash collection. So pneumatic tube, for those of you who don't know, you put your trash in and it gets basically sucked out and goes wherever it goes under the city. So we didn't see that in our research, but we saw that in talking about our research. People were talking about the pneumatic system of trash collection.
Like, why not do that?
And that was
Isn't
like
that
the
amazing?
future. That was the future. They were like the future of trash collection.
We did see a lot of contraptions that never came to light. So in the engineering journals, you would see, I don't know, just these self-moving things, or just
Garbage head.
garbage head. There was just lots of things. There was like one, like, in that good housekeeping slide that we had, like, it was basically people having their own incinerator in their home. You know what I mean? Like hack it. I think of it today with people like, I'm going to hack my vitamins and make this smoothie that has all my nutrients in a day. It's like people were doing that with their garbage. Like I'm going to do garbage collection so well, there will be nothing left for the collector because I'm processing it all in my house. So I think we saw a lot of that, like more like individual ingenuity. As for the cities, we just pretty much saw everyone using horses and carts. We did see one idea of actually using these carts that would have garbage cans on them. So they would put a dirty garbage can onto the cart and leave an empty garbage can at the person's house instead of dumping it. And then they would just take this cart of cans out of the city. As for disposal methods, they were all there was really just a list of them. Reduction, which, some of them tried for a while. Incineration, dumping in a lot, dumping to use as fill for cities, to fill out the land in cities, dumping in the river, just to let it go. Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you very much for a wonderful presentation and conversation. For the people who are joining us in person, we have books for sale right outside the door. For those of us joining us online, I hope that you'll go to your favorite online retailer and buy a Politics of Trash. Then you can talk trash whenever you want.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.